Aloha! This is chapter 22.1 and 2. We're going to be talking about the unification of Germany and especially about a personality that made it all possible, Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck is actually one of my favorite people. He was unbending and devious. He's known for uniting the German peoples through blood and iron. When we look at Germany, we think it's inevitable that it would be unified, partly because we have this idea that nations are eternal. They've always existed, and that it's basically a state of nature. However, that is not accurate. France was probably the oldest nation, quote unquote, in Europe, and England developed very quickly as well. But the rest of Europe was fractured little tiny kingdoms. Kingdom, it's a unit that revolves around a person. So it's more person related than geography related or land related. The person imposes his will on territory. That territory can change and shift. However, the kingdom remains as long as the king is in power. And nation is a different concept because it is territorial in nature. The territory exists, and whoever is ruling that territory can change. It's flexible, but the territory itself and the people who are living within the borders of that territory are part of that nation. The Germans were, for many centuries, weren't a nation. And it's not until after one of the earliest modern nation builders, Napoleon, came through the region and instilled that idea into the people that the idea of a German nation began to germinate. Napoleon comes to power in the late 1700s and early 1800s, and he immediately starts to conquer Europe. When he establishes his rule there, he creates an economic region which he dissolved any kind of taxation or tariffs that would have happened as goods are transported from one region to another in order to streamline trade and to improve the economy of the region. And it did improve the economy of the region. It was fabulously successful. Not only that, but Napoleon also instilled his Napoleonic law code onto the region, and that was also extremely helpful because up until then, they were really operating with a medieval style of law system, which was to some extent at the will or the whim of the ruler. So all of these things are related to developing the idea that nation status or nationhood is an essential part of being German. Okay, so that would have happened in the early 1800s. By the mid 1800s, Otto von Bismarck was of a noble family from Prussia. And Prussia, if we look at our maps, is way up north, northern part of Germany, and it stretches around the lower end of the Baltic Sea. It was one of the largest kingdoms in the region of the German kingdoms, and it had always had an uneasy relationship with the next largest kingdom, which were the Austrians. So the Austrian Empire is in the lower half of the Germanic area, and the Prussian Empire was in the northern half. And they both saw themselves as the new leaders of a new unified German territory. I think Prussia was probably even more precocious in their desire to have a unified German territory. Austria had their hands full with a bunch of other territory in the south, which included a lot of people that were not necessarily Germans or Germanic and spoke many different Slavic languages. So this is like the Balkans. There were also different religions that were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there were quite a lot of Muslims living there because it was brushing up against the Ottoman Empire. So Austria had their hands full, but Prussia was fairly mono-ethnic, I guess you could say. There was a large contingent of Jewish people who had moved to Prussia in the late 1700s, mid to late 1700s, to escape persecution in the rest of Europe, and they were invited there by some of the Russian Kaisers. Well, I guess that term wasn't being used yet, but they were invited by the King of Prussia at the time to settle there because they were seen as economic boosts. They helped the economy. They were really good at trade and banking and all the things that Germany wanted to develop in their territory. So Otto von Bismarck is a nobleman from what they called the Junker class, which is the noble class. He had really amazing opportunity. He was invited to work for King Wilhelm I of Prussia as a diplomat. He is actually sent to different places in Europe as a representative for Prussia. He is extremely loyal to the Prussian royal family. That is probably the one thing that doesn't change throughout his whole entire career. He wants to see the king of Prussia become the king of the new unified Germany. And so really his career is based on developing that. The thing that bugged Bismarck the most was the plebeian democracy. The Reichstag was an example of that, and they were always getting in the way of his ideas and his pushing towards strong and unified Germany with Prussia as the center. Part of that is because the Reichstag had representatives from other German states, and they were a little bit concerned with Prussia's aggressiveness. And so, because part of that would be each of these different German states would have to give up their own sovereignty, Otto von Bismarck wanted to have more money for the military. He felt that some of these territories that were owned by other countries would only be able to join if they were conquered. Territories that he had his eye on at this point, it was actually owned by Denmark. It was Schleswig and Holstein, which is kind of the Danish peninsula, upper part of the Danish peninsula. So he approaches Austria and he says, hey, Austria, let's have an alliance. We'll go together on attacking Denmark in order to gain these two provinces, and I will take Schleswig and you can take Holstein. Sounds good? And Austria's like, absolutely, let's do it. They had to go to the Reichstag to get money to do this, and the Reichstag was like, no, that sounds a little too aggressive. So Otto von Bismarck just cut it out of other budgets and got the money that he wanted, regardless of what their desires were. That tells you a lot about his style of doing things. He's really not going to let people get in the way of what he thinks needs to happen. They go to war against Denmark, and they are successful because the Prussian military really is one of the best militaries in Europe at this time. The thing is that a few months later, Prussia is going to turn around and actually declare war on its ally, on Austria, because there's another territory just above Austria called Bavaria and Saxony and Thuringia. I don't know how you would say that. Anyway, he wins against Austria and he gets more territory. So now Prussia is dramatically increased. And then there's territory that's owned by France. And so he has to figure out how to pick a fight with France without seeming like he's the one being the aggressor. There was some communication going on between the ruler of France at the time, whose name was Napoleon III, who had been chosen mainly because of his name. He was not by any means as effective a leader as Napoleon I, but he kind of felt like he was, and he'd been on the throne for quite a long time. He felt like France was definitely a strong country and able to take on anybody. And so Otto von Bismarck does something quite devious. King Wilhelm I gets a telegram and in return sends off a telegram, but it's intercepted by Otto von Bismarck, and it's tweaked until it sounds very derogatory and it sounds very offensive. And then it's sent along to Napoleon III. When he reads this, he's like, that's it. Those Germans have gotten too uppity. And so he basically declares war on Germany, thinking that this is going to be an easy walk in the park. And instead, the French army is obliterated. Napoleon III is actually captured on the field. It's an embarrassment. He's given back to France. The Germans didn't want to keep him prisoner, of course. They just wanted to embarrass him and humble him. And they take over basically Alsace-Lorraine and Baden and Hesse. So this territory is vital to German economic success because throughout the 1800s, Germany has been going through an industrial revolution. These territories are probably some of the most well-developed territories in Germany or France at the time. So this was coveted territory. When World War I starts, it's going to be because of this territory. Both France and Germany want to own this area. So this territory is really strategic because it has such huge natural resources. It's got a lot of coal and iron and a population that is skilled, all kinds of machinery and that kind of thing. So it's a very coveted territory. So this ends up extending Germany to the modern dimensions of Germany. But now Otto von Bismarck has to focus on internal unification, and he sees there are several different challenges. The first one is the Catholic Church, because most Catholics would consider themselves to be more loyal to the Pope than to Kaiser Wilhelm I. And so this is a major problem for Bismarck. He initiates something called Kulturkampf. This really backfires because he is attacking a sacred symbol for these Catholics, and about half the population is Catholic. He himself had grown up in a Lutheran family, but I don't think he himself was particularly religious. He wanted to show the Catholic Church to be weak and corrupt, and instead the Catholic Church ends up looking very positive during this time. And so he backs down away from that. And his next target are the socialists, the communists that have been growing rapidly, mainly because industrialization causes a greater divide between the rich and the poor. The poor generally are working in the factories and they are unhappy with a lot of the situation or the lifestyle that they are having to endure. So they're attracted to the socialist and communist ideology, and the idea of taking away private property was against his ideas of Prussia, the Prussia that he wanted to create. Instead of doing what he had done with the Catholics by directly targeting them, he is going to legislate things that they were actually arguing for, they were wanting, and kind of ripped the rug out from under their arguments, because they were arguing things like, you see, the factories, they don't care about their workers. They don't have any health care. They make us work such long hours. They have minimum wage. They don't allow us to have a union. So he did not allow them to have a union, but he did put in laws that made them force employers to limit the hours of the workday and all these things that socialist groups were really wanting to have. Although they were not allowed freedom of speech, they could not print what they wanted to. In some ways, he cut them off at the knees, and that is going to continue to boil under the surface.